Welcome. This is Professor Boileau. For the very beginning of our 5 pre-lectures on the December course in Structuralism and Phenomenology. Today, for lecture number 1, I'm going to give you an introductory set of materials and concepts, and then we'll move through some of the important figures in the 20th century. We're going to cover Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, Saussure, Lacan, Foucault, and we'll talk about other theorists like Kristeva, Althusser, Barth, but only in passing, and that's just in the interest of space and time. This is an introductory, very collapsed, condensed seminar. So again, it's on phenomenology and structuralism. And I'm going to be reading from notes that I've created and also from books that I've written. So you'll see me turn my face from time to time to do this. So phenomenology attempts to relocate the origins of meaning in our lived experience prior to the objectivism of positive science. Structuralism seeks to uncover unconscious or hidden structures of language that underpin the way we think about anything. And so if you don't go below the surface level, you're never going to understand what's really guiding any discourse. Okay. Phenomenology focuses on concrete thinking. It starts with Husserl at the very beginning of the 20th century. Attempts to ground science and theory in our lived experience, as opposed to them being separate from each other, split off from each other. We have Heidegger who takes over Husserl and turns this transcendental phenomenology into existential phenomenology. And Sartre reads Heidegger while in Germany and brings it to France and writes about it in really clever ways. Merleau-Ponty, his most famous book was The Phenomenology of Perception. It's a great book. You should read it. And makes the claim that phenomenology enables us to bring back all the living relationships of experience, etc. So what happens is that there are many possible worlds, many possible ontological structures, and then we have appearances from those ontological structures. Phenomenology seeks to inquire about those appearances. So it's hard to talk about phenomenology without also mentioning ontology. But think about it, if we assume that there's only one universe, one world, and we don't seek to uncover new perceptions and new possible worlds, then we're going to be really stuck in one set of appearances. And that's how you get fascism, totalitarianism, highly conservative models of social and political philosophy, and a very unhappy population. Structuralism, again, focuses on language and seeks structural laws. So we're going to see that in Lacan. When we study Lacan, we're gonna see that in Foucault's post-structuralism that we're going to talk about in this group of 5 lectures. There are 5 lectures. This is the first one. So you can see how this is related to Marxism. Marx talks about structures that um, determine how we think about things, our socioeconomic structures. And then we see that in Lacan. So ordinary language is not viewed as enough. There are people who would argue the opposite, that ordinary language is plenty, and that it articulates reality and just fine. But structuralism says that's not true. So So sure is the person we're going to study in this group of 5 lectures. And let me just mention a few preliminary concepts. So Saussure develops a science of signs, which we call semiology. And so it goes beyond the established norms of language and covers a wide range of signifying systems. So it's basically a science of signs. Which we'll talk about in a little bit. We have Barth, who decodes signs of mass media, Lacan, dreams, symptoms of the unconscious, Levi-Strauss, anthropology, Althusser, the discrimination between ideology and science, and Kristeva, to the signifying practices of literature and art. So I wrote a book called Genuine Reciprocity and Group Authenticity about 25 years ago that is an exploration of this distinction between structuralism and phenomenology. There's something really important at stake here. What's at stake and why you would even listen to these lectures is that there are some people on one side of the equation who believe we have complete agency. It's called volunteerism. We have complete agency to create meaning, constitute ourselves, constitute a world in a free way, and a lot of there are a lot of consequences of that view. There's a lot of freedom, moral agency, criminal agency, social and political responsibility. On the other side of things, the structuralist will argue that this is not true, that we are constituted by language. The very concept of self is constituted by language. Everything is constituted by some kind of hidden structure. And if we can't understand the underlying structure, then we're shooting in the dark. And the whole idea of freedom or self-constituting agency is just a total illusion. So psychoanalysis is one of those discourses that argues that we're not the master in our own house, that much of who we are as individuals is unconscious, and that our ego, or what it presents itself as conscious, is a really small part of the self, and that we don't really have that much freedom. So then you can think of integrating structuralism and phenomenology, which is a better way to think about it. Sure, of course, there are structures and languages, and then we have an experience of the self, an experience of freedom. And so it's a very interesting exploration in psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, social political philosophy, to think about how much freedom we really do have to think about things, or to create new language, or to challenge language concepts as they are right now. And so we see that in Foucault, who we're going to study in this series. So let's talk a little bit about existential phenomenology. It's been my argument that phenomenology is a corrective to cultural, social, individual distortions. The very practice and the very nature of phenomenology is to bring us back to ground zero, to see how our belief systems and our value systems really stack up to critical thinking. And so we have this idea of transcendence in consciousness. It's a capacity we have to always reinterpret our experience. Transcendence, so we can actually transcend old ways of thinking about things, and therefore radically reconstitute who we are and what we do. And in fact, that's what a lot of psychotherapy is based on, is that we can reconstitute the self. We can renew ourselves. We can change. We can transform. Well, this sort of thinking originates in existential phenomenology. So existential phenomenology has a critical function. It's not just purely descriptive. That's a first pass at existential phenomenology, is that it's purely descriptive. And indeed, it can be used in writing exercises, relaying experience in psychotherapy, having a cultural, social discussion. There's nothing wrong with description, but the whole point of description is to enable us to see, or enable us to relate that description of what we think reality is to this notion that we have freedom to create new worlds and therefore new descriptions. So you can see this happen on an individual level, right? You can describe your experience, and you can say to the therapist or the doctor that you don't feel well, you're in despair, through an elaborate description of your experience in the world. And then through our capacity for transcendence, you can see how you have freedom to change that. So, okay. So existential phenomenology exposes what lies beneath the values and truths we've chosen. I often use the word noetic or noesis. If you think of the world that you create, the world that you've constructed, there's two parts. There's that world you've constructed, which is that your noematic focus, but there's also the noetic focus, which is yourself, the person who actually creates that world. So that's the really interesting part, is to think about what goes into the way you construct a world. Because if you can tease apart those elements, you can start to see how there are possibilities for transformation and freedom. So existential phenomenology conflicts with scientific positivism and reductionism through this bracketing process. And it's very simple in one sense, is that we bracket our understanding of the world, and then we look at what's at the root of that. And then by doing that, we have a much clearer perspective about what has gone into the way we've created a world. And we can see if we want to change that or not. So all of these ways of thinking, including critical theory, which we're not going to cover, focus on the question of meaning. Who are we? Who am I? What does the world mean? What does the planet Earth mean? What are the meaning structures in the United States today? What are they based on? Those sorts of questions. So we're looking at the distinction between, say, knowledge and thinking, right, if you're on one side, and raw experience or being on the other. So in the reverse, we exist, we are, we participate in being, and that's part of it. And then the other part is that we think about it. So being and knowledge are two different things analytically. Okay. So Sartre himself, who we're going to study, I think, in lecture number 2, which will follow this lecture number 1, explores and investigates the relationship between our ego and the spontaneous flow of consciousness, our deeper self. The relationship between my spontaneous flow of consciousness and the way I construct a self. And so there are all sorts of ways to construct that relationship. Some people come into psychotherapy because they don't see any room for change, and they in fact are in total despair. Or we construct a social world and a cultural world that's really tightly woven. It's totalitarian, it's totalized. And you see a lot of aggression, you see edginess, you see violence, because people are seeking transformative capacity, but the cultural structure has condensed it and made it so that it's not as possible as it could be. And so we do the same things that happen for individuals happen for societies and cultures writ large. It's just on a smaller level or a bigger level. So what we're looking for in existential phenomenology is a way to retain the fullness of primordial experience in a way that avoids Cartesian logocentrism, that prioritizes the semantic over the semiotic, and that privileges the retentions and protensions of the living present over a punctuated now moment. Another way to say this is that we want to create a possibility for transcendence, or the transcendent self, or the transformational self, or the transformable self, who can intend a new world. This is the very foundation of freedom, and it's the very foundation of social change. That's why it's so important. We're taking a dive into clear language structure that helps us understand these possibilities. So structuralism and deconstruction share the philosophical viewpoint regarding sign theory. Their view, which has been referred to as semiological reductionism, loses the reference, fullness of sense, and subject within language. The philosophical presuppositions of such semiological reductionism challenge the very possibility of any phenomenology of language, and thus its survival as phenomenology or hermeneutics. So we're seeing these tensions between the depth of structure and the possibility of a phenomenology. One of the dialectics that you have to keep in mind is whether or not language goes all the way down to the very core of the human experience. So, one position is that it does, that we can't think about anything without language. There's no experience that we can even think. Without language. And another opposing view is that we have lots of experience that is primordial, and it doesn't originate in language. And ultimately, we can reach for a language toolkit and try to express that experience. And that second view is that language doesn't go all the way down. So the reason why option 2 might be better is because we think about poetry. Poetry always challenges language. Poetry is transformational in its very nature. So what it's doing is it's accessing transcendental faculties in language and saying, in these gaps of language, there is freedom to create new types of language structures. So language isn't completely closed. Okay. According to phenomenology, the essential dimension of one instance of experience properly described should grasp the very constitutive aspects of all instances of that type, provided that the focus on lived experience in a descriptive interpretation of essential dimensions is maintained. This is not to say that this can ever become a rigid framework, but it can and should be an elastic, fluid way of understanding the various dimensions and aspects of the existential perspective of human experience. So this helps us understand the basis for science. Science can't just be positivistic. It can't just be empirical. And the reason for that is because you can't get a scientific project off the ground unless you have meaning structures for why you're doing that scientific project, what that project means to humanity, what it means to that scientist, how it relates to the lived experience of human beings. So there's always a level of human experience below the level of science. And that's what's the really interesting part. The meaning that underlies a particular kind of science. You can always ask the meaning of a particular kind of science. So this opens up the door to think about creative noetic activity. Creative noetic activity. So creative noetic activity means that the knower or the thinker is drawing from all kinds of sources and personal experience to develop a starting point, a meaning structure, and a foundation for any kind of scientific project in the first instance. Anything we do has a meaning structure. And so does science. So as Merleau-Ponty asserts, quote, the scientific critique of the forms of space and time in non-Euclidean geometry and relativity physics has taught us to break with the common notion of a space and time without reference to the observer's situation, and enables us to give full ontological significance to certain descriptions of perceived space and time, to polymorphous space and time of which common sense and science retain only a few traces. This cognitive activity is intended to provide the resolution of a precarious or indeterminate situation, for knowledge is the fruit of the undertakings that transform a problematic situation into a resolved one. Within the second level scientific world, such objects emerge in the context of their meaning structures for the purpose of solving a problematic or perplexing situation, and thus answer to purposive, teleological, or goal-oriented activity. Thus, it can be said that the activity is guided by the possibilities latent within the meaning structures of experience that have been intentionally created, and it is this system of meanings with its possibilities or potentialities which directs and limits ongoing activity. Okay. There is, therefore, no reason why the reduction of phenomenology cannot be considered as an element of a basic philosophical and scientific method and attitude that can investigate the epistemic and the ontological dimensions of sense and experience. If this is a basic and all-pervasive philosophical attitude and method, then it will accompany the whole of the philosophical enterprise in whichever focus it takes. Thus, this method should be able to focus on the description of the knowing enterprise, investigating its epistemic claims even to the very originary level. But it can be equally used to describe the being of the knower. Such a phenomenology would be extended so that it returns to a lived experience in its unity of meaning structure and ontological reality. It attempts to examine the nature of meaning structures brought through experience to the independently there on the one hand, the character of the independently there, which enters constitutively into such structures. For existential phenomenology, the apprehension of structures is more fundamental than explanation and is not reducible to that mode of understanding. All existential phenomenologists had the problem of how to bridge the chasm between the empiricist and intellectual traditions of the past 3 centuries. The phenomenologists believed that neither empiricism nor intellectualism squarely faced the human situation by concentrating on either end of the self world or the I world relation that's given in consciousness. That's the subject-object dualism. They distort this relationship and fail to explain our existence as an I with world and with others in that world. So existential phenomenology takes this relation as the primitive fact. So problem is we interrogate a universe, but we're part of that universe. We can never completely step out of that universe. Naturalism treats man as a being that is determined by physical and material factors that determine him from the outside. That's how empiricism arises. Idealist intellectualism views man as the being who has a liberty in constructing representations of those same causes that act upon him. So we're part of the very phenomena we're trying to make sense of. Contemporary naturalism attempts to understand the higher, the spirit, in terms of the lower, which is normally thought of as the subhuman universe. Okay, here's the link. There's a close relationship between naturalism and positivist science. So phenomenology is not degrading science, but it's saying that science is only one type of truth-seeking enterprise. And it has to be grounded in a phenomenology. So, okay. Intellectualism moves in the opposite direction, attempting to interpret the lower in terms of the higher. Because the intellectual person who's a part of the intellectualism position believes that the higher gives the lower its sense. So it's the attempt to reveal the rational structures of the world by considering their intelligibility independently of any reference to sense experience. For example, Cartesianism takes clear and distinct ideas, the test of clearness and distinctness, to be the locus of authentic truth, which is an approach that becomes very important to understanding Sartre himself. So naturalism is a critical empiricism, which is either a psychologism or a positivism. All in the former, that's psychologism, all human truth derives from sense impressions. For the latter, which is positivism, all truth comes from only positive scientific truth. Yet, the phenomenologist argues that both forms are abstractions that are laid upon pre-scientific contact with the world. That is lived experience. And so you're going to see over and over again in all phenomenology the focus on lived experience, living that experience, pre-theoretical, living, enjoying. And therefore, sense impressions and scientific facts are constructed or are layered upon the lived world of natural perceptual experience. These objects then represent only a portion of the totality of our lived experience. And then on the other hand, intellectualism mistakenly holds that philosophical reflection is the primitive guarantor of truth. Well, we're going to learn from Foucault that that's not true. That what we take to be a capacity for philosophical reflection is already situated within a structuralist enterprise. Cultural influence, social influence, language influence, personal historical influence that comes at the very bottom, and it's very difficult to see these things. That's why psychoanalysis is viewed as having value or Marxism. Any kind of coded structure that you don't think about all the time, that's always latent, structures the very way you think about everything. Existential phenomenology attempts to expose these unexamined presuppositions that underlie both of the naturalist and intellectual systems by showing that these systems are only constructions of the mind and by returning to the things themselves. So let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about structuralism just a bit. Structuralism, we think about in cultural studies, social studies, political theory, sociology, linguistics, anthropology, psychoanalysis. And structuralism, therefore, has a method. The method is to analyze isolated events or meanings in terms of their underlying structural laws. So the idea is that there are deep structures or hidden structures beneath the surface of meaning. And this is not so far-fetched. This is another way to look at it, is to say that you're raised in a culture and in a history, and there are certain ways of doing things, tradition, etiquette, language, custom, and they're deeply rooted at the very bottom of your mind. And the very way that you think about anything as you go through grade school and high school, college and graduate school and beyond is always rooted in these really deep assumptions. And so it takes great work, great intellectual work to think about these things and to uncover them and to see how they've affected the way you think about anything. So Saussure, S-A-U-S-S-U-R-E, born in 1857, is considered to be the founding father of structuralism, the structuralist method. So he outlines a new linguistic theory, which came to be known as semiology, which is the science of signs. And he argues that language should be analyzed in terms of its internal structures. What language is in itself as a formal system of relations. Okay. And then we're going to apply his structural method when we talk about Foucault and Lacan and others. But let's just get a few concepts on the table. So his structuralist model sought to identify the formal laws of the total language system, which ultimately structures anything that we say. Anything we say comes from a structure. So he claims that a structural analysis of spoken language discloses its operations as a network of permutations between signs. And this is concealed. This law or this logic, this algorithm is mostly concealed. And he thought that it was really important to try to unconceal this structure. Okay. So language, he defines as the systematic totality of all possible usages of that language. And then within that, we have utterances, right? We have iterations, particular speech acts within that. And so all these possibilities come to bear in a particular situation we're in which we use language. You know, it's the context. And when you're born in a culture, you know what these possibilities are, and as you become an adult. But those possibilities are determined by the underlying structure. And if you break that structure, if you break it in the wrong way, you're viewed as crazy, or that you don't understand the language system. If you break it in the right way, you might be viewed as a great literary novelist, as a genius poet or something like that. So those language structures move through time, they evolve, they're not static. We coin new words, we coin new expressions. Some expressions are acceptable at one point in time, but not in another. That is because there's something that makes the language what it is. For Foucault, it's power, but it makes the language what it is, and then it changes through time as those elements change. So language is viewed as more of a universal or a timeless system. Speech is viewed as, you know, what you do in the here and now. This is very interesting. So, okay. Quote, he says, language is a system of interdependent terms in which the value of each term results solely from the simultaneous presence of the others. This is very interesting because he also asserted that the structural relationship between words, or between signified and signifier, is arbitrary. That is the key point. These utterances are arbitrary. It's a matter of social and cultural convention. So it's not natural. It's what we create, where we pick a particular word, a certain vocalization to express a certain meaning. Now, the other part of this, which is equally interesting and intriguing, in fact, is that it's the context that's super important. It's all the other signifiers, we'll say all the other words that are equally important to give space for a particular word or sentence to be used in a particular context. So you have all these interdependent terms floating around, and it's the relationship of the terms that creates the conditions under which we might speak a certain word or a certain phrase. So Saussure is arguing that the meaning of language is generated within language itself. It is not derived from some prior reality existing independently of language. So this is a really important position, as I mentioned before. For Saussure, the origin of meaning comes from the language itself. Change the language, change the meaning, change the origin of meaning. And this is a particularly critical philosophical question. the question of meaning, the origin of meaning, the source of meaning. Saussure is saying that meaning doesn't come from outside language. It's generated within language. So you can imagine how Marx's theories were so, in this way, brilliant, because what he's saying is that the socioeconomic structure in which we have the proletariat workers, the owners of production, depending upon where you are in this social structure, whether you're a very wealthy aristocrat or an affluent person, member of the bourgeoisie, or super poor proletarian, the way that you see reality is determined by that structure. And it's also determined by where you are in that structure. And so we have a language then that purports to explain that structure. So you can imagine that if you could, if a government could provide a language for its citizens, it could determine all of reality. And that's why there is such a big concern about internet companies like Facebook and Google having so much power over the noosphere, determining the mind space of all the citizens of the United States and beyond through these sign systems. So it's not just spoken words and language, it's sign systems, it's images that we're bombarded with. People start to believe those. They start to think that they are what is reality. But what Saussure is implying is that meaning itself comes from this language structure. Now, what the phenomenologists want to say is that there's a transcendental shadow. I call it a transcendental shadow to any utterance or any written word, or even the total structure of language in a culture. There's a transcendental shadow. And what that means is there's always a space within which we can take a perspective on that language. Even if we're using the language to take a perspective on the language, we're still putting it into question. Putting it into question, either through dialogue or interrogation or polemic, means we're unsettling those meaning structures, and we're suggesting that there could be other possibilities. So that's why it's so critical to read Saussure, I think, where he's claiming the origin of meaning is in language itself. So if you're a creative person and you like to write poetry, you can see how even in your own poetry, whether or not you're a great poet, there's an attempt to unsettle the normal and regular use of language. And it's that unsettling that has a critical function. Okay, so then, therefore, in structuralism, there's no outside the language, there just is language. And so in science, we can see the claim that scientific positivism becomes the range of reality. That's it. You might have a different methodology. You might say, well, history defines the range of reality, or psychoanalysis defines the range of reality. But what existential phenomenology says is that there's a shadow to that range of reality, because words aren't just what they are. Words have connotations, and even you can use Saussure against himself. You can say the meaning of words within a structure is always determined by the interdependence of the words in that context. So you can use a word in many different ways. But what that's saying is that a word is not just what it is. A word itself has transcendent features. It's elastic, depending upon the total context of all the other words in that conversation. So is there an outside the language? Is there, and don't just think flat-footed on this. Outside the language means, can we put language into question through dialogue or interrogation? And what is that? Is there primordial experience? Well, of course there is. Many theorists, including Kristeva herself, cogently show us how we have all sorts of profound experience before we have language. But that's the question. I can tell you that structures run deep, and it's a worthwhile pursuit to think about those structures. At the same time, it's equally worthwhile to think about critical, transcendental perspectives within language or against language. And we can see then how for our mini lectures here, our 5 lectures, how important it is to think about both sides. So we're gonna for the lecture number 2, we're gonna study Sartre. We're gonna study existential phenomenology through Sartre's eyes. Very super short mini lecture. Lecture number 3, we're gonna study Foucault, who's labeled a post-structuralist, but who's basically helping us understand structuralism and developing a theory that shows really an existential phenomenological position where we could have freedom within structure. Lecture number 4, we're going to study Lacan. Everybody at GCAS loves Lacan. I teach Lacan, so we're going to do Lacan. Lacan is a great structuralist, just like Freud was a great structuralist, just like Marx was a great structuralist, in part. And then lecture 5, I'm going to continue to present this dialogue between existential phenomenology and structuralism by using the figures of Sartre and Foucault to do that. Now, these are just arbitrary choices. There, of course, are other phenomenologists, there are other structuralists, but this should give, by the time you're done with this should give us enough content to actually sit in our discussion sections in our December GCAS course on existential phenomenology and structuralism. That's the whole point. That's why you're watching these. So this ends lecture number 1, this mini lecture, and then the lecture number 2 will be on Sartre, on phenomenology.